come to the closure of the symbols phase with symbols 12. And perhaps it's important to remind us that we are participating in a recutting of world civilization. All civilizations were jewels that were brought together by transformations of many ratios of cultures. And cultures were developed over the last 70,000 years by our species out of a previous level of life that was pre-cultural. And that pre-cultural era went back into what we would call today the very earliest Paleolithic. And that earliest Paleolithic occurs in South Africa about 160,000 years ago, when the first evidences of our species began to surface. And our species, Homo sapiens, occurred as the latest and a whole resonant order of Homo species going back about 2 million years. And our Homo resonances of species fit into previous hominids that go back several million years beyond that. And so we have like a curious target effect of very vast, long stretches of time that concentrically become more and more condensed. And as it does so, it's as if the pressure of condensation causes organic life to generate more complex species as one goes along. And so there's an evolution that is occurring that is speeded up, not just an evolution that is there in nature, but an evolution that is there condensed out of nature into a more specific application. And that more specific condensing application is experience. As more and more complex versions of organic life in the primate mode, in the hominid clad, began to condense, the quality of complexity changed the way in which experience was able to operate. About 70,000 years ago, in Africa, not just South Africa by that time, but in what is today Ethiopia and parts of Kenya, there was a jump in our species, Homo sapiens, that for the very first time, two distinct qualities of artifact are found for the very first time. One, you find a technological improvement on the way in which tools and weapons are made, and at the same time, two, you find personal decoration for the first time. You find carved shells made into beads for necklaces, for earrings. And so you find a personal sense of cosmetic appeal, an aesthetic element, and a technological development, a scientific beginning. And so about 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens concomitantly developed the roots of arts and science together. The reason that they are always paired is that they are higher registries of a differential harmonic. The first registry is on the level of personal. The second is on the level of cosmos. And so the differential order has two distinct registries with the same calibration but raised to a higher power. Person and cosmos occur together as differential orders and are related to but transformed out of nature. A nature that extends back for untold billions of years. Life first occurred on this particular planet about 3 billion years ago with the bacteria, who are still around. Primates, out of which we evolved, have been around for 70 million years. But individuals like ourselves that have a cultural matrix date back about 70,000 years. Those cultural aspects began to develop faster than evolution had ever developed before, but it still, in our calibration, took a long time. By about 47,000 years ago was the first time that Homo sapiens left Africa and began to explore the rest of the world. And a curious, recently notable pattern was that when Homo sapiens left Africa to go and explore the rest of the world, they took the very same path and the very same development that a previous species to us, a hominid species to us, did 2 million years ago. Homo erectus was a species. The first Homo erectus skeleton that we had was of a young man who was about 17. He was almost 6 feet high, and he was obviously built like an athlete. Lived 2 million years ago. His skeleton was found by Richard Leakey and his friends on the edge of Ethiopia and Kenya. When we had our nature lectures, I brought in the volume on it, and we talked about that kind of aspect. We talked about how Richard Leakey had been raised from a little boy, from a baby, by his father Louis and his mother Mary, and they were the first of the great paleontologists that went into trying to find the traces of early man. And how the two parents used to take their 3 boys with them all the time on the expeditions and the camping trips, and they were literally raised looking for earlier traces of hominid life. And how it was that Richard Leakey never wanted to be a paleontologist, hated the thought of it, and yet had it imbibed in his bones since he was born and cultivated in his culture all his life. And he was piloting an aircraft, a little Cessna type aircraft with a friend, when he flew over the site along what used to be called Lake Rudolph on the Ethiopian-Kenya border, and he looked out of the plane and he saw the site where he would find the skeletal remains of Homo erectus from 2 million years ago. He knew it was there. He knew that on that sandbar area on the lake, that's where it was. He knew that. He knew that because when the body and the mind are matured in such a way that their maturation is open, a jewel-like transform of the imagination occurs and it becomes creative. And it is the creative imagination that creates the arts and sciences, that creates the person and the cosmos as well. We're looking at a development that after almost 50,000 years, our species now populates the entire planet by almost 7 billion people. But the variants of culture, though they were large, thousands and thousands of different cultures, there have only been a handful of civilizations, a couple dozen at the most, really less than 10. And the civilizations are a further condensation where not just cultures maturing, you can't make a civilization out of a matured culture. It's out of the interplay and ratioing of many different cultures that you get the condensation that causes a different level of experience to begin to shine. It's like if you have a cloud of interstellar dust that gets condensed enough, it will burst into a star. A civilization is the bursting of human experience into the star of a civilization. Whereas the culture is still just the swirl of the dust beginning to get into its configuration of a protostellar disk. But the civilization is when the star radiates, it glows. All the previous civilizations on this planet died. They all failed. And part of the difficulty, especially for the last 100 or so years, was to try and appreciate why is this, what is happening. Because our species, once it has ratcheted up, you can't live without the radiance that one has already achieved. You can't go back and stuff a species that has already become civilized to the point to where it could be a planetary civilization and expect that one can just go back and live on the street in a pop culture mode. It doesn't work. It produces, first of all, a neurotic chaos, and then it produces a psychotic suicide. So this work that's been going on for 40 years, in this learning, is the most sophisticated presentation that's ever been done in human history, to not just bring another civilization into play, but to bring a further transform of civilization into a creative possibility. It is not only new, it is newer than new. You know, when they made the first folio of Shakespeare after he had been dead for almost 10 years, all of his great friends got together in London. They said, let's make a book out of our favorite guy's best plays. And in the first folio of Shakespeare, you have about 23 of his plays. And one of them that had not really been printed before, The Tempest, for instance, was never printed before, but another one was Troilus and Cressida. And one of the men who got together to make the first folio, his name was Ben Jonson. He was one of the great playwrights of Elizabethan England. And he wrote a preface to Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, and he said, "Dear reader, newer news than ever, you may find in this play more wit than you have brain to grind it upon. Take your time to get to learn it. And don't criticize it preemptively, because this is a new level of drama that you have not seen before. This is an education that no one has seen before because it never existed before. It is not only a planetary putting together of all of the cultures, and we need a planetary culture, but a civilization is a star, not a protostellar disk. The civilization needs to be more intense and brighter, and doesn't obviate cultures at all, but invites them to go into a shared community together where something even brighter is able to occur in their midst, and it is something that is shared in common. And so while we have a planetary culture that is necessary in the early 21st century, we need a more powerful civilization that is larger. We need a civilization that's at least the size of one star system, the entire star system. Not an interplanetary civilization, but a stellar, a star system civilization. Because it's only on the level of star systems that the larger spread of reality occurs. The atoms of a galaxy are star systems. Whole star systems. A map of 3 dimensions is being prepared of all of the stars that are nearby our star. It's going to be a cube of space about 20-some light years on a side. And in that cube, there are literally hundreds of star systems. That cube of 20 light years is like dipping your toe into the surf of the Pacific Ocean. If you go out 100 light years from our star and you get a cube 100 light years, you get tens of thousands of star systems. And that doesn't even get you out of the neighborhood. Our arm of the Milky Way galaxy has hundreds of billions of stars. And the galaxy has over 2 trillion. And that's just one galaxy out of trillions. So the atomic minimum of a viable, conscious reality for living beings is a star system civilization. So we have our work cut out. But you cannot make it on the basis of tribalism, or on the basis of ego, or on the basis of expectations of something that you already thought of. It has to be engendered in ways that you have to grow, to be able to mature, to be able to absorb, and then apply. And this takes a learning which is refinable all the time on every detail indefinitely. Because then one has what Robert Oppenheimer so lovely called in one of his last books, the open mind. The man who first brought the atomic bomb into being and then was castigated and thrown out as being, well, maybe he's a communist sympathizer, and they took away his security clearance. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Open Mind. It was called The Open Mind because there was a book called The Open Mind by one of the great math geniuses of the early 20th century, Hermann Weyl, who was the developer of group theory in mathematics in the 20s. And he had a book called The Open Mind as well. Niels Bohr, in his letter to Franklin Roosevelt just before the atomic bomb was set off, said, in the atomic world, we have to have an open world because there's no way that we will not have a nuclear catastrophe for the entire planet if we are compartmentalized in the old ways. It has to be a world that is not only open, it is at home being open. It will be its natural human state. But an open world is not sustainable by itself. The only way to keep the world open is to keep this world in its star system minimally, so that there are many different worlds, many different possibilities, all the time. And one doesn't commandeer this beautiful blue planet as an empire by anybody, for any reason. And so part of the development here is that by taking phases which alternate, we get used to an introduction of a binary quality of digitalizing education for the first time, not compartmentalizing it, not forcing it into some false perspective, but to give it the natural syncopation of the cadence of actual occurrence. And that the syncopation is just like in a musical registry. It isn't just 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, but that there's a natural pairing of the cadence, so it comes out 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then with its further transform, it comes out so that it is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you get this kind of motion where the pairedness of the syncopation is itself paired, and then that paired pair is paired. So what you get is not just the syncopation raised once to a square, but raised a third time to a cube. And it's only by getting to where you have a cubic volume of the possibilities of experience that you begin to get to the verge of what is fundamentally real in terms of actual space. And so you have to also put into there a receptivity for that space to be sensitive to time, so that time is able to occur all the way through it and give the cube of the syncopation a rhythm. And only when one has then a rhythmic space does one have the environment where life could really not only exist, but could exist to the point of maturing to where it can harbor a fifth dimension that comes in to creatively make variants on the rhythms and the space together. And that fifth dimension is consciousness. So that one now begins to have for the very first time not only a rhythmic cubic space for organic life leading to us, but it has the ability to make variants so that civilizations could exist as well. And so our learning is something that has never been seen before. It's never been tried before, though there have been attempts, and we're talking in our symbols 9, 10, 11, 12. Notice the cadence. Here's symbols 12. We're using the pairedness, the binary, the basic bit, so that it is not a conflict, dual, one against one, a two-ness that is split. But we're using pairedness so that the pairedness carrying all the way through has with it a quality. Hermann Weyl wrote a beautiful little book for Princeton about 50 years ago called Symmetry. That symmetry is the characteristic shape of the way in which natural universal order occurs. And when symmetry is raised out of nature to like an ultimate form, an ultimate order, then that symmetry occurs in three groupings brought together so that one has not just a 1, 2, but one has a cube of the 2, one has 6. And the first mathematician to ever understand that the cube of symmetry is a 6-figured shape of an essential element of nature everywhere in the universe. That mathematician was named Johannes Kepler. And he wrote a monograph on the snowflake. And he said, in the snowflake, we have water raised to its cubic, volumetric shape in terms of natural reality, that when it snows on any planet, in any part of God's universe, it snows snowflakes. We know today that not only does water become snowflakes, but methane as well becomes snowflakes. On Neptune, the methane snows are so intense and have been going on for billions of years that the methane snowflakes slowly condense as they fall into Neptune, and they become more and more gelled, and the methane snow eventually becomes compressed into diamonds. And so it rains diamonds in the interior of Neptune all the time for billions of years. And part of its blueness is the blueness of methane raised to the level of jewels. Now look, folks. It is a happy, joyous thing to mature. To be able to not only get your head above water, but to learn how to swim and to learn how to build boats and navigate and to sail free. That's something. And that's what we're up to. We're taking in symbols 9, 10, 11, 12. We're taking Blake and Yeats because they were at a watershed. Blake born in 1757 and Yeats dying in 1939. And in between those dates, one has an enormous crunch in the modern world. Yeats died just about the time World War II began. Blake was born just about the first time that Benjamin Franklin left Philadelphia and went to London to become the Grand Minister for the then just nascent insight that there needs to be a United States. No one believed Franklin when he submitted the Albany Plan for Union in 1754. No one understood it. They said, well, this is Benjamin Franklin. And within 20 years, everyone understood. This is something we need to do, and it was done. This education is essential. This learning is essential. We need to shift from subjects that compartmentalize to phases that bring symmetry back into the balance of whatever scale of shape and order we wish to develop. It'll be there. In nature, there are two kinds of forms. One is a form of structure, the other is a form of order. Physical existence is based on structure. The ritual actions of objectivity make structural elements that hold together structurally, so that rituals structure the way in which objective action really happens and does something, holds stability, makes elements that can be put together to be stable. And out of the stability of ritual action comes culture. But the mind is not just a structure. The mind is an orderer. It groups. It makes ratios. That's why it's called rational, ratioing. The mind orders structure into higher, more condensed complexities, and then gives it symbolic nexes so that that stability and that higher order hold, and that the higher order not only holds statically, but forms like an axial pivot, so that the entire order is not only held together by symbols, but it is indexed by symbolic extensions called ideas. And so the mind orders the structures of existence and indexes them by ideas. And in order for those two functions to work together, they need to be blended together by a chef who knows how to make the spice and the entree go together, and that's called the imagination. And the imagination is the bringing together, the integrating of an image base. Because that image base actually occurs in experience. Those images not only occur as images, but they, because of their ritual origin, they tend to want to sequence. So the images naturally then, in experience, tend to make little vignettes. This picture, that picture, that picture. So you get the sequencing of images, the sequencing of pictures. And as the sequencing of pictures happens, one learns then the fundamentals of how to put the images into a sound expression, and sound becomes oral language in just that way. And the imagination takes the oral language sequencing of images and begins to make pictographs, which are the little idea elements that go into making a written language. And that's how it happens, folks. But that's only half the story. Because when you get to the capacity to have an imagination and ideas and symbols, the complexity of the mind is such that it wants to become something other than an aggregate. It wants to blossom into radiance. And as the spiritual person who is the blossoming into radiance of the complexity of the well-nourished mind. When you are on the ritual level, our kind of being acts in actions, in figures, figurations. But those figurations acquire an ability in the process of experience, of myth, to be configurations. The flow of the figures in motion by the deepening qualities of the feelings and the images and the spoken language, the culture. So that culture is a flow configuration of experience. And that flow has no longer just figures, but the figures acquire character. And the character is not that it is just made or that it's put there. It is there and is teased out. And by the time one gets to culture, one gets to wanting to have the beads and the improved tools. One begins to have the need to make improvements. And so the character is the experiential development of figuration in configuration, so that the character tends to be at home in the flow of configuring, and that's where myth comes from, mythology. To configure all of the ritual elements into this flow, into these stories, these vignettes. And it's out of that intense nourishment that character becomes individuality in the mind. Yeah. The I-ness is in the mind, but has a very direct, it's like a bar of referentiality to one's body through one's experience. So that the identity is the order and the structure braided together through a nourished experience. And a shared experience will make a culture. And so people's identities will not just be me, they will be us. We're similar. And part of having that kind of definition normally excludes others who are not like us. And one of the difficulties is that there are whole energies that transcend those narrow definitions. And Yeats and Blake are two of the greatest individuals of the last couple of hundred years who were geniuses so far beyond the definitions of individuality that they never, ever in their lives had any problem. They were like Richard Leakey. They could tell by looking at something, that's where it is. I don't know what it means, but that's where it is. And one of the things that happened for young William Blake, he was in his 20s, is he met a man in London who had devoted his entire life to starting to translate Plato and all the Neoplatonists named Thomas Taylor. And Blake was very close to Thomas Taylor all of his life. And for Yeats, it was stepped up because his friend went to the jeweled transform of Plato and was the greatest translator of that jeweled transform of Plato for 1,500 years. He was an Irishman named Stephen McKenna. McKenna was a soldier of fortune. He was an international journalist. This is back in the 1880s, 1890s. And while he was in Moscow, he got a copy of a translation of Plotinus. And so he decided he's going to devote his life to preparing himself and to make a translation of Plotinus into English. And it's Stephen McKenna's struggle to translate Plotinus into English that influenced Blake, successor named W.B. Yeats. So as Blake and Thomas Taylor were related, Stephen McKenna and Yeats are related. It's the stepping up from Plato to Plotinus. And when we come back from the break, we'll realize what a huge intensity this was. It's the intensity of taking something that was the star philosophic genius of a city, Athens, and making a radiant giant star of the greatest vision of world civilization in Greco-Roman antiquity. The leap from a city to the entire world. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the relationship. We're trying to understand how parallels occur in resonance. When you're dealing with persons, when you're dealing with spiritual persons who are works of art, and the cosmos, which is scientific, the arts and the sciences do not align. They're not in measurement alignments. Remember a couple of days ago, the President of the United States saying you have to be able to measure to educate. No. You have to be able to calibrate so that you don't just measure, but you group the resonances so they make a harmonic. Conscious dimension adds a harmonic transform to the way in which all measurement happens. So it isn't just adding and subtracting. It isn't just multiplying and dividing. It isn't just a commutation. It isn't just arithmetic. It becomes a mathematic. And so the differential consciousness makes of the arts and sciences differential forms that have harmonic calibrations, not bars of measurement, not hierarchies, but whole expansions. And not only do the forms become differential so that they are harmonic, and you go by the expansions and the possibilities, the range of the array is literally infinite. Not only the forms, but the processes as well. And the two processes of the differential ecology, one is vision, consciousness. The other is history, which is civilization. So that civilization is not a form. It's a process. And it's not an integral process, it's a differential process. So that history is very difficult to work with because it has been misconceived twice. So that it is flawed on two orders beyond what the mind thought it was, which is why all civilizations before perished. They were not founded in a way that they could really be. And so what took their place was some kind of idea in the mind of a doctrine that everybody is going to follow and to drag you out of your natural culture and put you into the order that the state or the empire says you must be in. And the inculcation of flawed order reduced what was the nascent developments of civilization back into codified ritual imprisonments to tyrannies. So that all civilizations died ignobly. They died because everyone was being inculcated by having to belong to the same culture that was an ideational tyranny. It wasn't a natural culture at all. It was an ideology imposed. And the imposition was always from some false vision. Oh, we're going to have a Third Reich that will last 1,000 years. Congratulations. You ruined hundreds of millions of lives in only 12 years. That's really a great record to have. And in the 21st century, to have empires and ideologies again trying to surface with the same old failed formulas is not only stupid, it is idiocy. Let's come back to the relationship of Blake to Yeats is very interesting because Blake comes at the beginning when science for the first time was becoming effective at making a technology which could be expanded into a new scale of industry. By the time he was a young man in the 1770s, you began to not only have the shift from, say, alchemy to chemistry, but the development of chemistry into industrial scale processes. And by the time that Blake died in the late 1820s, already you had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution that changed the scale of what was possible for human beings to do in a very real way. You not only had nicely graded roads for the horse carts, you had for the first time parallel steel bars that carried railroads. You went from horseback to railroads overnight in the 1840s. And within 2 generations, almost every application in the world received that kind of superdose of technological industrial might. So that by the time Yeats was writing in the early 1920s, that's 80 years ago already, he was frightened because he had come to understand that writers like himself, gifted people who had this from a little boy, being able, like Blake, not just to envision things, but he had psychic capacities that were sensitized beyond, not just beyond the norm, beyond the upper edge of what people used to think could be possible. If you've never met anyone with psychic powers, it's a little unnerving at first. How can they do that? How can they know? But for them, it is completely natural. It's no big thing. My friend Stephen Schwartz took a group of psychic archaeologists to Egypt in the 1970s. And they would walk around in places like Alexandria and say, this is where this building was, and such a thing happened. And the Egyptian government was very suspect. Who are these Americans who come and they're psychics? And so they took them outside of Alexandria, out into the desert, and said, all right, if you're psychics, find something out here. And in the wastes outside of Alexandria, in these stony desert plains, one of the psychics came to a site and said, well, here, if you dig, I don't know what it is, but there's a building down there, and there's a room that has a central pillar, and I don't know what it is, but it's here. And of course, the Egyptian government was very glad to dig because this was going to discredit everything. And they dug because they knew no classic buildings ever had a pillar in the center. And so they dug and they found exactly what was described. They found this little temple, and instead of a statue on one end, it had a pillar in the center. It was exactly where the psychic said. Yeats was that kind of an individual. But he not only had the psychic ability, like a clairvoyant or somebody telepathic, he could look at historical time psychically. But he didn't use his psyche to look at it. He used his poetic envisioning consciousness to look at it. And as he did so, he saw more and more that he was living as a mature man at a crossroads, and that for some reason, one of the biggest crunches of talent was in the Ireland of his day, that the Ireland of his day, from the 1880s to about the 1940s, in those 60 years, had an extraordinary confluence of talented individuals beyond belief. In plays, you had George Bernard Shaw, John Millington Synge. Synge was a friend of Yeats and wrote plays for his Abbey Theatre in Dublin. Synge's plays, The Shadow of the Glen, Riders to the Sea, The Well of the Saints, The Playboy of the Western World, Deirdre of the Sorrows. All of these individuals like Shaw or Synge, or like James Joyce in New Stream of Consciousness, not just writing a novel like The Portrait of the Artist as a young man, but writing Ulysses, and then writing Finnegan's Wake. Joyce wrote a letter to Ezra Pound. He said, I'm going to do to Ulysses what those old Irish monks did to the New Testament. I'm going to illuminate it. And so Finnegan's Wake is a catastrophically radical expansion of the stream of consciousness of Ulysses, almost beyond the capacity of somebody to read it, to have language. When he was a young man, Joseph Campbell did a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake, and that was the sign of his coming of age. And then, of course, you had Yeats, and you had a translator of Plotinus like Stephen McKenna. You had a dramatic writer like Lady Gregory, a mystical poet and a writer like A.E. It was packed, and these are just some of the major figures. There were dozens of others. It goes back 1,000 years. It's like Joyce illuminating Ulysses to make Finnegan's Wake. 1,000 years before, the Irish visionary genius at the turn of the millennium was likewise cued in. 1,000 years before Yeats wrote A Vision, the Irish visionaries were illuminating the New Testament and creating something like the Book of Kells. The original Book of Kells is in Trinity College, Dublin, the library, and they turn a page every week. And these are huge illuminated pages that take the New Testament and deliver it into its jeweled matrix. This isn't a writing where the writing is in a language that the mind reads, or that one can just read from a written text. These are words that are jewels, and they're arranged in the royal tiaras and jewelry, necklaces and bracelets and rings of a radiant, flashing, conscious kind of language that is magical. And so one has to learn to not to read at it, but to look through it and to read visionarily. William Blake, in one of his very interesting quotations, said, most people will look at a window and see it composing what one sees within it. He said, I look at windows to look through them. So the visionary, not the visionary mind, but the visionary spirit goes through the frames of the mind and doesn't see ideas structuring ritual action, but sees the illuminative radiance, the star-like jeweled quality that is possible if one did it a little bit differently. And so one's learning jumps at least 4 orders beyond instruction. And you don't just learn 4 times faster, you learn exponentially faster and faster. I once estimated that somebody who does this program of 2 years, you can raise your IQ about 10%. If you keep doing it and keep adding it, it isn't just another 10, but it's 100% after that. And then it's 1,000%. Modern 3rd millennium AD civilization requires us to be complex enough to absorb IQs of several thousand. But one can't even measure it because those IQs, intelligent quotients, are ratios of a purely integral order, and they are outdistanced by incredible amounts by someone who's really consciously mature. And for someone who is historically mature as well, you're dealing with a scale of beings that would seem to the man on the street today to really be aliens. But they're the ones who are at home in the starry expanses that are really there. Take a look tonight. They're really there. In 1922, trying to come to terms with what he saw, Yeats realized that there was a scale of millennia, that every 1,000 years things would jump. And so that's why there are all these millennial movements. And he saw, well, if we look then to the appearance of Jesus, and we look 2,000 years after him to 2000 AD, there's going to be a jump, but not a jump from Jesus, but a jump from what happened 1,000 years ago. That 1,000 years ago, in the year 1000, there was a millennial jump. And not only did the millennial jump of the year 1000 spur the production of illuminated books like the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Darrow, and so forth, in the late 900s. But when the year 1000 came, that's when the idea came of the First Crusade. We have to go back as Christian warriors and take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. And so the whole development of hundreds of years of the Crusades are all due to a millennial movement and ideology at the time. One of the qualities that Yeats saw is that the year 2000 AD was going to be one of these millennial triggers. And because it's built into the ritual cycle of the mind's projection symbolically, the only way that you can mitigate that is to mature the mind beyond itself into a poetic, visionary aesthetic. Yeats, unfortunately, didn't understand that the science had to go with it. But he wrote this kind of poem called The Second Coming, of saying, well, we tried to recover the Holy Land for the first millennium, so the second millennium will be the coming again, but it's not going to be the second coming of Jesus, but something anti-Jesus. And so he wrote this poem. It's just 2 stanzas. It's called The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubled my sight somewhere in the sands of a desert. A shape with lion body and the head of a man. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to get born. It was the year T.S. Eliot brought out The Wasteland, the year Joyce brought out Ulysses, Proust brought out Remembrance of Things Past. The development of atomic physics took a huge jump with Lord Rutherford, and the nucleus formed atom, and many other things. Part of the difficulty that Yeats found is that for him, being super sensitive, being psychic, and then being visionary on top of it, then being poetic on top of that, he looked to try to understand what had happened. Why is it then that it is so confused? And the tradition said over and over again, all the time, through every generation, throughout the ages, that what happens is that the empires commandeer and the true genius has to go underground, and that's how it becomes occult, becomes hidden. So if the true understanding is hidden, and the world's authority is something that is just on the ideationally enforced, tyrannical outside, and so one has to look, Yeats was convinced, one has to look for the secret tradition. One has to look to the occult areas. And one of the things that got to him, and Stephen McKenna brought it out more than anyone else, is that the so-called classical tradition has a hidden sap running like an underground river through it, and that underground river, that occult sap of the classical tradition, is the only way that one can trace one's way back to the ocean of reality. You have to be able to follow that underground stream. And if you do, it'll lead you to that ocean. That ocean is there. And so what one has to do is to be able to go deep enough somewhere to get down to that hidden stream and then stay there the course and follow it all the way to the oceanic openness. For him, he realized that Plotinus, for him, in his time, was that taproot that could go down, because Plotinus, for the first time in 1,500 years, was being translated in a way in which the English language could express all of the scope and the delicacy of Plotinus, and that Plotinus occupied a very special place. Plotinus came about a millennium after Homer, about 1,000 years after Homer. And so for Yeats, he looked to see where in my predecessor, visionary William Blake, did Blake get down to Plotinus? He knew that he knew a lot about the Platonic tradition, but Thomas Taylor also translated Plotinus. Only the translations of Plotinus by Thomas Taylor were only put out in editions of less than 50. So hardly anybody had ever seen them, had ever read them. The first popular edition of Thomas Taylor's Plotinus was selected by G.R.S. Mead, Madame Blavatsky's last secretary, and were published in the Bones Popular Library, the modern library editions of the late 19th century. And that was the first time that any kind of selection of Plotinus, but Stephen McKenna's Plotinus is about 100 times more refined than Taylor, not because Taylor's is bad. It's that McKenna, with this Irish Celtic visionary genius, devoted his whole life to learning how to go into Plotinus's complex Greek. It isn't just complex because the language is refined, it's complex because it is a consciously aesthetic language raised to a cosmic level. Plotinus is concerned with the spirit being able to return resonantly home to the cosmos. And so he never wrote the Aeneads down. He didn't write anything. He only spoke a supposedly mythic process, but he spoke by transposing the mythic process to the conscious differential process. And so when he spoke with a conscious differential language that has a very special tone to it. It is seamless in its spontaneity and infinite in its resonant depth. Whereas a mythic language will always be based on images, a conscious language is magical. It's not based on images. It uses symbols like myth would use images. A conscious language uses symbols and then raises them to a poetic. An integral language will use images and bring them together in the mind as a style that is like rhetoric, a rhetorical ordering, whereas a poetic is several orders above a rhetoric. It doesn't go by order, it goes by harmonic possibilities. Poetry, not instruction manuals. And so you had Plotinus speaking on this refined level, and it was only because there were certain people that were hearing him speak, and they wrote down what he said. And one of his prize students, a man from Syria, born in Tyre on the Phoenician coast of the Middle East, his name was Porphyry, because he was a rather interesting character. Porphyry is the royal purple color in Roman times. And by the time he was a mature man, he heard that the greatest spiritual teacher in the world alive at the time was Plotinus. And so he went to Rome where Plotinus taught. Plotinus taught out of his own home. His students were the Roman emperor of the time, Aurelian, and his wife, about a half dozen of the most intelligent of the Roman senators, a number of doctors and other people, very sophisticated men and women. And Plotinus was one of these trustworthy persons. When intelligent Roman people would die, they would leave their villas and their wealth and put the care of their children or grandchildren into Plotinus's hands, and he always took care of these things, but lived very frugally himself. And finally, the cream of the Roman Senate and the Roman Emperor decided that they would build a special school for Plotinus. Plato had his academy, which was a school, but Plotinus' school was going to be a philosophic city, an entire city devoted to letting people mature from birth through all the phases of life so that the entire city would be a school of wisdom. And just when they were ready to build that, down in the Campania, south of Rome, an epidemic of diphtheria hit Rome, and Plotinus died. And Aurelian was busied elsewhere, and it was never built. But the dream, or rather the vision of it, had been so real, but not real in ritual, integral, worldly things, but real in the objective registry of the spiritual transform of the psyche. So that whenever anyone got down there, they got to that last point that was reached. We need to have not just a wisdom school, but the wisdom school has to be opened up so that the entire city now is a resonance of the wisdom school. So at the first time in 1,000 years after the Roman Empire became not just Christian, a version of Christianity that was tyrannical. They killed you if you didn't confess the belief that authorities wanted you to have. They became the new Romans. And in order to ensure that this would happen, it used to be called the Dark Ages for centuries. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, said that for 1,000 years, the plane of Western intellectual achievement looks like a barren desert. He used a musical term called pianissimo. Such subtle, negligent fluctuations that it's only like a gray sound. There's no harmony whatsoever. It's like an electronic, whispering, kind of slowly modulating aimlessly. A pianissimo. What changed it was the rediscovery of Plato, and deeper in Plato of the Hermetic core, and deeper than that, the transform of the Hermetic core into Plotinus. And the rediscovery of that was what made the Renaissance in Florence. And so not only did Cosimo de' Medici and his son and his grandson and his great-grandson found the Platonic Academy in Fiesole on the ridge outside on the edge of what was then Florence, a big yellow building, a villa owned in our own time by Lawrence Rockefeller. Wonderful Lawrence S. Rockefeller. He's my patron for 10 years. Not only was the Florentine Academy there, but the Florentine Academy, through the Medici, influenced the entire city of Florence so that it became the Florentine Renaissance. The Platonic Academy was to train a handful of people who would seed the Renaissance, but the Renaissance was in the city, the Florentine Republic. Who would listen to Ficino, who was the head of the Academy, the young Michelangelo, the young Botticelli, the young Pico della Mirandola, and on, Lorenzo de' Medici. All the makers of the Florentine Renaissance were his students. And towards the end of his life, Ficino managed to translate Plotinus, but he translated him not into English. And so it had to be translated into English, which wasn't done, and wasn't done, and wasn't done. And Thomas Taylor made the first attempt to do this, but when Stephen McKenna came along, with his Yeatsian-like poetic vision, people who understood history said, this is the moment, this is the time. In the 20th century, we need to do this. And so the Medici Society, fed by many conscious people of the time, sponsored Stephen McKenna's translation of Plotinus. The first volume came out in 1917 and was finally finished in 1930, right at the same time that Yeats was writing A Vision. So McKenna's Plotinus is contemporary with Yeats's A Vision. And it's all about the way in which visionary consciousness, raised to a differential harmonic form aesthetically of a poetic, can be further raised through historical civilization to a new process where a new cosmos will come out. All of this was so powerful at the time that it appealed to many different kinds of people, many different areas. In France, for instance, two great scholars, Henri and Schweitzer, began to put out the feelers of doing a new text of Plato, and Plotinus rather, to make sure that Plotinus's complex Greek was in as tight of a text as possible. And they were spurred on not only by McKenna doing his translation, but there was a great savant in Paris, Émile Brachier, doing Plotinus's Aeneads into French. The first volume came out This is the first edition, 1924, and was finished in 1938, just a year after A Vision was published. So McKenna in Dublin, in Brahir, in Paris, were seeking to bring up Plotinus exactly at the same time as the development of early atomic physics and of Yeats's A Vision and many other things happening in the world all at that same time. By the way, there is a Penguin Classics edition of McKenna's Aeneads now, abridged and put out with notes by John Dillon, who was the great Neoplatonic scholar of the last 45 years. And because the text was being established so wonderfully with the Greek text, A.H. Armstrong brought out in the Harvard Loeb Classical Library a New English translation based on the new text in 7 volumes. The first volume came out in 1966. I remember seeing it when it first came out, and it was unbelievable, and finished up with volume 7 in 1988. If you get interested, the best single introduction to Plotinus is J.M. Rist from the University of Toronto, Plotinus, The Road to Reality, published by Cambridge University Press. The reason that Toronto had a scholar like Rist is because at the University of Toronto, the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies was founded, and it was a powerhouse of scholarship there. And one of the things that they brought out not too long ago, just about 30 years ago, not very much time, in these things was an edition of Porphyry's Isagoge. And the Isagoge of Porphyry was for 1,800 years the standard introduction to Aristotle's logic. Because when you're intelligent on this mature level, you can see into everything. And in the classical times of the late 200s AD, they thought that Aristotle is the logician to teach you how to think. Plato is the theologian who teaches you how to transform thought into vision, into the art of living, into the science of being. Published by the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. It was the standard introduction for 1,800 years. There is a great deal more. I don't go into detail. It is for you to go into detail on Blake and Yeats and all the other things that are offered. This is not a course of instruction. It's not just a course of encouragement. We're reconfiguring our experience on at least 6 levels above what it was before. It takes a while to do that. What will happen is that you will tend to think of it as a parfait, as an overlay. Let it have its swirl. Instead of being an overlay of levels, it'll become like that French marbled paper, full of visionary possibilities of your own. The maturation is yours, but it's shareable. Next week we come to the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. He's a contemporary of Plotinus, and in India was the ultimate yogi. Next week.